I can't understand for the life of me why people like Rogue One, a Star Wars story, so much other than the Star Wars branding. So today, we thought we would expand our initial drunk review and explain in greater depth the problems that Rogue One had and our concerns with the future of Disney Star Wars solo movies. To start this analysis, I want to point out how pointless its creation was. We learned all we needed to learn in the opening call of Star Wars. The plans for the Death Star were obtained. So why do we need this film that does nothing to add to the story it is an incredibly direct prequel to? Disney tried to force this movie to be Star Wars Part 1, how the less cool shit happened in order to squeeze more money out of Star Wars. In some ways, though, it is a more effective prequel to Star Wars than episodes 1 through 3. But this movie, in my opinion, is even more unnecessary in the expansion of the franchise than the 3 preceding prequels. In many ways, this film is also less enjoyable than the prequels. It is like choosing between Batman v Superman and Batman and Robin. One is long and horribly boring, while the other is so shitty it's hilarious. But at the end of the day, they're both bad films. So why do either exist? Looking at the characters, we have Jyn. Jyn is the main character because she has a vagina. I have seen this film 3 times, and every time I have seen it, I understood why she was the main character less and less each time. She has no personality and spends so much time brooding. By the time I realized I'm supposed to like her as a character, she's dead. By definition, since she has no arc, she is not the main character, but no one else has an arc either because this movie is a rushed mess. Attempts to force us to like her, like having her rescue babies and being the most optimistic person ever, fell flat when you realize that there's no precedent in her acting this way. In fact, generally at the start of the film it was the opposite. I guess her dad making the Death Star causes her to be the protagonist. Her arc with Saw Gerrera is also very poor. We learn he raised her to be a warrior but did not see that, or a resolution to their apparently strained relationship. Speaking of Saw, his character was fucking pointless. He came in, tentacle-raped Booty Rook for information, then talked to Jyn for 5 minutes and died, because he was too lazy to even attempt to escape. His death lacks any emotional depth, because he came out of nowhere and died. Next, let's look at Cassian. Before this movie came out, Disney was chalking this guy up to be a super memorable, morally gray Han Solo ripoff. But he only killed one guy who was unarmed before becoming essentially another normal rebel and cheap Han Solo post-character development. Except Disney made a whoopsie and forgot to write the character development into this film, as it would take away from the time they had for AT-ATs and other shitty cameos. We will come back to that. Another memorable character was Chirrut Imui, aka Chinese Marketing Man, but I'll just call him Ip Man for this. Ip Man is an Asian man who worships the Buddhist gods of Master Yoda. He runs around and beats the shit out of hundreds of stormtroopers using martial arts and his magic bow staff that can also turn into a laser shooting archery bow. His scenes vary between Hawkeye and Ip Man. I guess he is wise. For no real reason, he joins the rebels flying around with no questions asked. Baze Malibus was just an Ip Man groupie who was used just to jerk tears when he was killed like common bantha fodder. Bahudi Rook should have been the main character, but he wasn't, because this movie needed a female lead because demographic research. He was an ex-Imperial pilot that essentially put the entire plot in motion by knowing about the Death Star plans and where to get him. He is also the character closest to having an arc, as he decided he hated the Empire and ran off to tell Saw of the plans. Although his entire arc takes place off-screen before the movie starts, so yeah. So why did the movie not start with him running off from the Empire, pepper in some action scenes, and have him meet with some other characters? Combine him with Jyn, and then you can just cut the crap out about how Jin's dad was forced to make the Death Star. This change would cut a lot of shit out and add about 45 minutes to establish characters, and you could just cut Jyn out of the film, and bing bang boom. A movie that has characters we care about with a properly flowing plot. But anyhow, let's look at our final main character, K2SO Binks. or Redditatron over 9000, or Sheldbot Koopatron, or Billybot the Blue Rain.
Did you know that wasn't me?
Or Billybot the Blue Robo Ranger. He's essentially a robot with advanced equipping protocols. He was almost as bad as Jar Jar, just 1 foot in the poopy short. I was astounded that he made it into this movie. The antagonist in this film is somehow less clearly defined than the protagonist, but if we again base it on who had the most screen time, I guess it's director Krennic. For the antagonist, Krennic was a real pussy, who sits there getting ordered around by Tarkin and Vader most of the film. I am most shocked the Emperor himself did not go to bitch him out as well. Krennic is not effective as an antagonist because past the initial abduction of Jin's father, he really did nothing but get yelled at until he eventually got shot and nuked out of existence. Next, Grand Moff Tarkin. Tarkin should not have been in this movie. He adds nothing that Krennic shouldn't have been able to add. He takes every shred of intimidation that Krennic should have had and just bosses him around. Interestingly, they added someone else even less necessary. Can you guess who it is? That's right, Darth Vader. Darth Vader was pointless in this movie. He belonged in there just as much as those AT-ATs. Not at all. Darth Vader also bitched out Krennic in the majority of his scenes and even got to drop a quip in.
Be careful not to choke on your aspirations, Director.
It was very embarrassing. Vader also added a pointless lightsaber scene that was included to make blind fanboys shit their pants. Another confusing thing about Vader's character is why he's the highest ranking guy in this movie, so much that even Tarkin goes out of his way to get him to come to the beach planet, and yet, in A New Hope, he was more like a super powerful lackey to the Emperor, who everyone just bossed around and kind of laughed at.
Don't try to frighten us with your sorcerer's ways, Lord Vader. Your sad devotion to that ancient religion has not helped you conjure up the stolen data tapes, or given you clairvoyance enough to find the rebels' hidden fort.
But I guess if Krennic bitched him out, then the fanboys would be butthurt that Darth Vader, the chosen one himself, would be bitched out by some grandpa racist who hates women. 99% of this movie was shit we've seen before. Most of these callbacks were shitty. Many went as far to be downright cringy. Let's start with the cameos. The cameo that had me scratching my head the most was the Cantina guys that Obi-Wan cuts up in Star Wars. They literally walk into the frame, bump into Jin, and then walk off, and apparently fly right to Tatooine to get carved up by Obi-Wan mere days after the town they were in gets Death Star nuked.
He doesn't like you.
I'm sorry.
I don't like you either. You just watch yourself. We're wanted men. I have the death sentence on 12 systems.
I'll be careful.
You'll be dead.
Another cringy duo to show up was none other than C-3PO and R2, just put in for applause, and it felt very out of place. Moving on from that, other things we've seen before include AT-ATs, which for some reason were on a heavily guarded Empire-ruled planet, which seems strange as I've always assumed AT-ATs were made to destroy whole armies. How would they be useful unless a huge militia broke out, which seems pretty unlikely. If it was an AT-ST, I'd believe it, but it seems like they just wanted an excuse to flash a bigger vehicle in for coolness effect, and so fans would be happy they get to see something that they've seen before. Here are some old sayings we've heard many times before.
I've got a bad feeling about it.
Quiet.
What?
Do I also need to mention Darth Vader's Mustafar castle? Like, is he Skeletor or something? That is just way too fucking cheesy. There's also a good amount of stock footage, like how they put scenes of Wedge and Tilly's and other X-Wing pilots in the battle, in their X-Wings. A good amount of Death Star footage was stock footage as well. The one thing I can really commend this movie for, though, was the world building. I loved the Rain Planet and the Dubai Super Beach Planet. I was not super hot on the idea of yet another sand planet, but when it was revealed it was just Syria, I was fine with it more so than like Jakku, which was just a pointless Tatooine clone. The new Stormtrooper designs were cool, even though it was a translucent ploy to sell toys. Finally, I really liked the ship battles. I appreciate how they did the Shin Godzilla thing where it was CGI but kind of looked like the old school models. It was cool and done really well. Speaking of CGI, there were also some CGI abominations in this film, in the form of Grand Moff Tarkin and Princess Leia, who both looked incredibly shitty in this film. Grand Moff Tarkin almost looked okay, but he wasn't quite there and fell too far down the uncanny valley to trick the eye, and it came off as creepy and disrespectful to bring a classic actor like Peter Cushing back from the dead. Princess Leia looked like absolute shit. She had a horse face and looked pale and shiny like those creepy Marilyn Monroe Snicker commercials. A note for Disney: the technology is not there yet. Develop it for like 5 more years and try again. Maybe it wouldn't confuse your audience on why some Halo 4 characters just showed up in a live-action Star Wars movie. I also want to note that it was recently confirmed they're going to CGI or stock footage Leia into Episode 9. More likely than not, they're just going to CGI her in, because that's what they did in this fucking movie, so why not? This also opens the possibility for Disney to continue making Star Wars movies long after the original actors are dead and gone. The movie's story isn't without its massive flaws. Jyn goes from being some random criminal to being a trusted and loved member of the rebellion without any scene of her making the transition, and it makes the entire movie feel rushed to see one person so thoroughly dominate the discussion of every single character around her to advance the plot. Almost every character in this movie dies needlessly, and this problem persists throughout the movie. Saw gives his life up in an act of defiance to, nobody. Ip Man is killed because he refuses to move after flipping the switch. Bodhi is killed by some random grenade to get him out of the movie. And Baz dies walking into a grenade he so easily could have got away from to avenge his friend. The movie ends with Jyn and Cassian just giving up and dying on the beach. The only death with any amount of impact is, surprisingly, K2SO Cooper, who actually gives up his life in order to protect Jyn and Cassian in a noble, not stupid sacrifice. Director Krennic also never gets a real conclusion. He never really interacts with our heroes until the very end, where he gets shot, not by Jyn but by Cassian. He survives the hit and then gets Death Starred away in the cheesiest death one can imagine. This movie is also full of all sorts of terrible cliche things, such as characters constantly shooting their enemies without looking, like Hawkeye in the Avengers, Jyn's shooting the Stormtrooper in the dick, K2SO not looking but throwing a grenade behind him to blow up multiple troopers, and K2SO shooting a Stormtrooper as he passes through the door. The movie also has other very generic scenes, like a baby crying in a war zone, the dad dying in Jyn's arms, and so on. The movie feels like a printed template filled with Star Wars related terms and objects. The movie fails to be a standalone film as advertised because it hinges on the knowledge of Episode 4 and Star Wars as a whole. Characters like Tarkin, Vader, and Leia aren't introduced, they just appear. Seeing these characters would have been incredibly confusing to someone who'd never seen Star Wars before. The final scene of Vader cutting up the rebels is entirely meaningless without prior knowledge of this character. Instead of ending the movie with a big action scene or a chase scene, characters stand around trying to activate a panel to transmit the plans, which is a pretty boring climax to the movie. It's not really exciting to see this ensemble cast not really work together. Really, it should have been more of a spy movie where everyone uses their unique talents to go through the base undetected, some giving up their lives to protect others for the greater good, and then maybe when they actually die, they could have died at the hands of actual, villains or stormtroopers, not just getting grenaded by some off-camera adversary. But whatever. This film is also designed to address a plot hole that never existed in the first place. In A New Hope, the exhaust port to the Death Star's core is a design flaw found when the plans were looked at in depth. A small oversight like this in such a huge design is just something that happens, and the oversight was so insignificant the Empire never imagined it would be the downfall of their superweapon. To pin this as an intentional trap for the Empire seems to just be a convenience, because there is more drama in someone doing it on purpose, despite it never being indicated in Episode 4 or anywhere else in Star Wars lore previously. Despite its comparisons to films like Saving Private Ryan, this film has very little that actually deserves this comparison. It's hardly a war film. Even the scenes of war, the main characters are off doing their own thing. There's no grittiness to the fighting, it's just more Star Wars fighting, but outside. It's possible that in an earlier version before reshoots, this movie was more similar, but I doubt it quite a bit judging on the product we got. Honestly, Rogue One was a disappointment, and I urge fans of Star Wars to keep Disney in check by keeping them accountable when they make a bad film so we can receive more good films rather than the garbage nostalgia fest we got like this. Episode 7 was a pretty good film. Honestly, it did a lot hinging on A New Hope and previous films in the franchise, but at least it expanded and added something. This film added nothing. It was a completely pointless plot that no one cared about nor needed to see ever, and honestly it just adds an extra chapter into the Star Wars saga that didn't need to be there. We don't need to see Star Wars .5 because this is an absolutely pointless movie with pointless characters that we never grow to like, and the only way we could ever like them later is if they toss them in one of Dave Filoni's animated Star Wars shows, just like shoehorning them in there, so it's like, oh, but remember when Jyn Erso helped Luke Skywalker or some shit? The shit's retarded. Fuck this movie.